During my hospital checkup, the doctor asked my dad, "Are we using the same donor as the first child?" I was 12 years old and sitting on the examination table in Dr. Brennan's office when I heard those words. The paper covering crinkled under me as I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the table. Dr. Brennan stood by the door with my father, both of them speaking in low voices they thought I couldn't hear. But the acoustics in that small room carried every word straight to where I sat. My father glanced at me quickly, then back to Dr. Brennan, and nodded once. His face had that tight expression he got when he was making business decisions, the same look he wore when he fired employees at his company. Dr. Brennan made a note on his tablet and said we'd schedule the procedure for next month, that the recipient was already prepared and waiting. My father asked about compensation, and Dr. Brennan mentioned a figure that made my father's shoulders relax. They shook hands like they'd just closed a deal. I sat there trying to understand what I'd heard, while my brain worked to make sense of the words: donor, first child, recipient. My older brother Ethan had been the first child. He'd died 2 years ago at 14 in what my parents called a tragic surgical complication. Dr. Brennan turned back to me with his professional smile and said I was in excellent health for my age. He took more blood samples than usual, filling 6 vials that he labeled carefully and placed in a refrigerated case. He measured my height and weight with extra precision, recording everything in a file marked with my name and a series of numbers I didn't recognize. He examined my abdomen thoroughly, pressing on different areas and asking if anything hurt. Everything felt wrong about this appointment, different from regular checkups. When we left the office, my father was on his phone immediately, talking to someone about confirming dates and making arrangements. In the car, I asked what this doctor meant about donors, and my father's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He said I'd misheard, that Dr. Brennan was discussing organ donation awareness, a program the hospital was promoting. But his voice had that false brightness that meant he was lying. The same tone he'd used when he told me Ethan died from complications and not to ask questions about what happened. I sat in the passenger seat watching the city pass by and thought about my brother. Ethan had been healthy and strong, an athlete who ran track and played basketball. Then suddenly he'd needed surgery, something urgent that my parents wouldn't explain in detail. They'd said it was a minor procedure, routine, nothing to worry about. But Ethan never came home from that surgery. The funeral had been closed casket, and my parents told everyone that Ethan's body had been too damaged from the complications. I'd been 10 years old and drowning in grief, unable to understand why my brother was gone so suddenly. Now I was 12, and I'd heard a doctor ask my father about using the same donor as the first child. The word donor kept circling in my head. People who died could be organ donors, giving their organs to save other lives. But the way Dr. Brennan said it, with that clinical detachment and discussion of compensation, made it sound like something else entirely. We pulled into our driveway and my father told me to go inside and start my homework. He stayed in the car on his phone, his voice rising occasionally, though I couldn't make out the words. Inside the house, my mother was cooking dinner with the television on in the background. She asked how the checkup went, and I said fine, watching her face carefully. She smiled, but her eyes were tight with anxiety. She asked if Dr. Brennan had mentioned anything special, and I said no, just that I was healthy. Her relief was visible and immediate. That evening at dinner, my parents were quieter than usual. They asked about school, and I gave bland answers, my mind still working through what I'd overheard. My father mentioned we'd need to schedule another appointment with Dr. Brennan next month, and my mother nodded, saying she'd put it on the calendar. They exchanged a look across the table that I'd seen before, a silent communication that excluded me completely. After dinner, I went to my room and opened my laptop. I searched for Dr. Brennan's name combined with organ donation and found his practice was affiliated with several hospitals and research facilities. His specialization was listed as transplant surgery and pediatric organ procurement. The words made my skin crawl. Pediatric organ procurement meant getting organs from children. I searched for Ethan's name combined with organ donation and found nothing. No articles about a teenage athlete who died tragically and donated his organs to help others. Nothing about our family or what had happened. It was as if Ethan's death had been deliberately kept quiet. I spent 3 hours going down internet rabbit holes, finding fragments of information that painted a disturbing picture. There were forums where people discussed the illegal organ trade, desperate patients willing to pay enormous sums for transplants without waiting on official donor lists. There were whistleblower accounts from medical professionals who'd witnessed organs being harvested from victims in ways that violated every ethical guideline. The stories were horrifying and hard to verify, but they made my overheard conversation with Dr. Brennan feel more sinister. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about Ethan in that hospital 2 years ago. I'd wanted to visit him before the surgery, but my parents said no, that he needed rest, and I'd see him when he came home. Except he never came home. They'd cremated his body immediately, saying it was what Ethan wanted, though I'd never heard him mention anything about cremation preferences. We'd never had a viewing or a wake where friends could say goodbye. The funeral had been brief and closed, attended only by immediate family. Looking back now with 2 years of distance and the context of what I'd heard today, everything about Ethan's death felt orchestrated and hidden. The next morning at breakfast, I watched my parents closely. My father read his phone while eating, his expression neutral and closed off. My mother pushed food around her plate without eating much, her wedding ring clicking against her coffee mug nervously. I asked them directly what kind of surgery Ethan had before he died. The silence that followed was profound and heavy. My father set down his phone and said it had been an emergency procedure on his kidney, that there'd been unexpected complications. My mother's face went pale, and she excused herself from the table. I pressed further, asking why Ethan needed kidney surgery when he'd been completely healthy. My father's expression hardened, and he said some medical conditions developed suddenly, without warning. He told me to stop asking questions about Ethan because it upset my mother and we all needed to move forward. I went to school but couldn't focus on classes. My mind kept replaying the conversation between Dr. Brennan and my father. Are we using the same donor as the first child? The phrasing was wrong for asking if I'd be an organ donor after death. It sounded like they were planning to use me as a donor while I was alive. Living organ donation was possible for kidneys and parts of livers and lungs, but those procedures were voluntary and carefully regulated. People chose to donate organs to save family members or others in need. But compensation for organ donation was illegal, and I'd clearly heard Dr. Brennan mention payment. Everything about this felt criminal and deliberate. During lunch, I sat alone in the library and searched for information about illegal organ harvesting. The articles I found were disturbing. In some countries, impoverished people sold kidneys to survive financially. In others, prisoners and marginalized populations were used as unwilling donors. There were documented cases of children being kidnapped and killed for their organs, their bodies found with surgical incisions and missing kidneys or other organs. The international organ trade was worth billions of dollars, driven by desperate patients who couldn't wait years on transplant lists and were willing to pay any price for a chance at survival. I'd read about these horrors happening in distant places, never imagining they could touch my own life. But what if my father, always focused on money and business opportunities, had gotten involved in something like this? What if he'd agreed to let Ethan be used as an organ donor in exchange for payment? I felt sick thinking about it, but the pieces fit too well to ignore. My father's company had been struggling financially 3 years ago. I remembered him taking phone calls late at night, arguing about debts and payments. Then suddenly, everything had improved. We'd moved to a bigger house and my father had started driving expensive cars. He'd said his business had landed a major contract, but what if the real source of money had been something else? What if he'd sold Ethan's organs to wealthy recipients through Dr. Brennan's network? And now, 2 years later, they were planning to do the same thing to me. The realization hit me with physical force, and I had to put my head down on the library table to keep from vomiting. My own father was planning to have me surgically harvested for organs so he could collect payment from desperate transplant recipients. The casual way he'd discussed it with Dr. Brennan, like a business transaction, made it clear this wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. Ethan had been the first child used as a donor, and I was next. I needed to figure out what to do before next month's scheduled procedure. I couldn't go to my parents because they were orchestrating this. I couldn't go to Dr. Brennan because he was facilitating it. I needed evidence, and I needed help from someone outside my family's control. That afternoon after school, I went home and waited until my parents were occupied. My father was in his home office on a conference call, and my mother was at the grocery store. I slipped into my father's office and started searching through his files. He kept everything meticulously organized in filing cabinets and on his computer. I started with the filing cabinets, looking for anything related to Ethan or medical expenses. In a folder marked Personal Financial Records, I found bank statements showing large deposits over the past 3 years. The amounts varied, but were consistently 5 or 6 figures, deposited quarterly from an account labeled Brennan Medical Services. The deposits had started 3 years ago, shortly before Ethan's death. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands shaking so badly, the images came out blurry. I had to steady my arms against the filing cabinet and reshoot several pages. In another folder marked Legal Documents, I found a contract between my father and something called Phoenix Transplant Network. The contract was dense with legal language I didn't fully understand, but certain phrases stood out clearly. Provision of compatible donors, compensation structure based on organ viability, liability waivers for medical complications. There was a schedule attached listing potential recipients with their medical needs and offered compensation amounts. One entry from 2 years ago listed a 14-year-old male donor and kidney transplant recipient with a compensation amount of $300,000. The date matched exactly with when Ethan had his surgery. I photographed every page of the contract, working as quickly as I could while listening for sounds of my father ending his call. The contract had been signed by my father and by Dr. Brennan, representing Phoenix Transplant Network. There were sections detailing how donors would be medically evaluated and prepared, how procedures would be conducted to minimize risk to the donor while maximizing organ viability, and how compensation would be structured to avoid detection by authorities. It was a blueprint for illegal organ harvesting, carefully worded to sound quasi-legitimate while describing something fundamentally criminal. I found another section listing future potential donors with medical profiles and compatibility assessments. My name was there with my blood type and detailed health information. Next to my name was a notation for scheduled procurement and a recipient ID number. The procedure was scheduled for 6 weeks from now, exactly matching when my father had said we'd need another appointment with Dr. Brennan. I felt cold reading my name in that document, seeing myself categorized as a future organ source with an assigned value. I photographed everything and was closing the filing cabinet when I heard my father's office door start to open. I ducked behind his desk just as he walked in, moving quickly to shove the files back into place. My father crossed to his desk and picked up a folder, then left again without noticing me crouched behind the furniture. I waited 30 seconds before slipping out and returning to my room, my heart pounding hard enough to hurt. I spent that evening reviewing the photos on my phone, zooming in to read every detail I'd captured. The evidence was clear and damning. My father had entered into a contract to provide his children as organ donors in exchange for substantial payments. Ethan had been the first, killed during a procedure to harvest his kidney for a wealthy recipient. I was next on the schedule, set to undergo the same fate in 6 weeks. The contract specified that donors would be kept alive during procedures when possible, but acknowledged that complications could result in donor death. There were liability waivers absolving Dr. Brennan and Phoenix Transplant Network of responsibility for any outcomes. My father had signed away his children's lives and safety for money multiple times over the past 3 years based on the payment schedule. I needed to get this evidence to authorities before the scheduled procedure date. But I also needed to be careful because if my father realized I'd found these documents, he might accelerate the timeline or do something to silence me. I was 12 years old, up against adults who'd already killed my brother and were planning to kill me. The odds felt impossible, but I didn't have a choice. I had to fight, or I'd end up dead and cremated just like Ethan, my organs inside strangers who'd paid for them. The next morning, I told my parents I wasn't feeling well and wanted to stay home from school. My mother felt my forehead and said I didn't have a fever, but I insisted I felt dizzy and nauseous. She exchanged a look with my father, who said maybe I should stay home and rest, that we didn't want me getting sick before next month's appointment. The casual way he said it, pretending to care about my health while actually worrying about keeping me viable as an organ source, made me want to scream. After my father left for work and my mother went to run errands, I grabbed my laptop and phone and left through the back door. I walked to the public library 3 blocks away and used their computers to research legal aid organizations and law enforcement agencies that handled human trafficking and organ trade cases. I found contact information for an FBI field office that specialized in organized crime and human trafficking. I also found a legal aid clinic that offered free consultations for minors in crisis situations. I called the FBI tip line from a library phone and explained what I'd discovered, speaking quickly and trying to sound credible despite my age. The agent who answered took my information seriously and said they'd send someone to meet with me. She asked where I was, and I gave the library address, then asked if they could come soon because I was afraid my father would realize I was gone. She said an agent would be there within 30 minutes and that I should stay in a public area until they arrived. I sat in the library main reading room, where I could see the entrance, and waited. 25 minutes later, 2 people in business suits entered and spoke to the librarian, who pointed in my direction. They approached and showed me FBI credentials, introducing themselves as Agent Victoria Landry and Agent Keith Barnes. We moved to a small conference room the library provided, and I showed them everything on my phone, the photographs of the contract and bank statements and scheduled procedures. Agent Landry examined each image carefully, while Agent Barnes took notes. They asked detailed questions about my family situation, about Ethan's death, about Dr. Brennan, and what I'd overheard during my checkup. I answered everything as thoroughly as I could, trying to stay calm and factual rather than emotional. Agent Landry said this was serious enough to warrant immediate investigation and protective custody for me. She said they'd need to verify the documents and build a case against Dr. Brennan and my father, but the evidence I'd gathered was substantial. Agent Barnes said they'd dealt with illegal organ trade cases before, but most involved international criminal networks. A domestic operation involving a physician and parents selling their own children was unusual and particularly disturbing. They needed to move carefully to avoid tipping off the network before they could arrest everyone involved. Agent Landry called Child Protective Services while Agent Barnes contacted the FBI's Organized Crime Unit. Within an hour, I was placed in emergency foster care with a family that specialized in housing children in witness protection scenarios. They explained I couldn't go home because my father would realize I'd gone to authorities and he might try to flee or destroy evidence. I'd be safe with my foster family until the investigation concluded and charges were filed. The foster family was named the Kowalskis, a middle-aged couple with no other children in the house. They were kind but professional, treating me like a temporary guest rather than trying to replace my parents. I had my own room and they gave me space to process everything while also providing meals and basic supervision. That first night in their house, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. He'd probably been told he was going in for surgery to help someone, maybe even convinced it was noble and safe. Then they'd taken his kidney and something had gone wrong, either deliberately or through genuine complications, and he died on that operating table. My parents had let it happen for $300,000. They'd mourned him publicly while privately counting the money from his death. And then, they'd started preparing me as the next donor, waiting until I was old enough and healthy enough to be viable for harvest. The FBI investigation moved quickly once they had my evidence. They obtained warrants to search Dr. Brennan's office and my father's business records. They raided the office on a Friday morning and found extensive files on dozens of children who'd been evaluated as potential organ donors. They found medical records, compatibility assessments, and correspondence with wealthy recipients willing to pay enormous sums for transplants outside legal channels. Dr. Brennan was arrested at his office, along with 3 other physicians who worked with him. The raids made national news within hours. Local television stations covered the story about a pediatric transplant surgeon running an illegal organ harvesting ring using children from financially desperate families. My father was arrested at his office the same day, charged with conspiracy to commit murder, human trafficking, and illegal organ sales. My mother was arrested at our house, charged as an accessory for her knowledge and participation in the scheme. The news coverage showed my parents being led away in handcuffs, both of them keeping their heads down to avoid cameras. I watched from the Kowalskis' living room, feeling detached and numb. Those were the people who were supposed to protect me, who'd instead sold me and Ethan to the highest bidders. The investigation expanded as FBI agents traced Phoenix Transplant Network's operations across multiple states. They discovered the organization had been running for over a decade, recruiting desperate families and corrupt physicians to supply organs for wealthy recipients who couldn't or wouldn't wait on legal transplant lists. The network had sophisticated money laundering operations and connections to organized crime groups that provided logistical support. Over 50 children had been used as organ donors through this network, with at least 12 deaths during or after procedures. Ethan had been one of 12 children killed by this organization, reduced to body parts and monetary value by people who saw transplant medicine as a lucrative black market opportunity. The other children who'd survived their procedures had permanent health complications and psychological trauma from what had been done to them. The FBI located several families who'd participated in the network, some coerced through debt and threats, others who'd voluntarily sold their children's organs for money. My father fell into the latter category. Investigators found emails where he'd actively negotiated higher compensation for my organs based on my blood type compatibility and overall health. He'd literally been marketing his son to potential recipients, highlighting my athletic abilities and clean medical history as selling points. Reading those emails during the investigation, seeing my own father describe me in terms of organ quality and market value broke something fundamental in my understanding of family and trust. The trial started 8 months later. My father and mother were tried separately, though both faced similar charges. Dr. Brennan and 7 other physicians were tried as a group for their roles in the network. I had to testify at all the trials, walking through how I'd overheard the conversation between Dr. Brennan and my father, how I'd found the contracts and financial records, and how I'd pieced together what had happened to Ethan. Defense attorneys tried to paint me as a confused child who'd misunderstood adult conversations and misinterpreted legal documents. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The contracts explicitly described organ harvesting procedures and compensation structures. The bank records showed consistent payments matching exactly with procedures performed on child donors. Medical records documented what had been done to Ethan and what had been planned for me. The prosecution called several other families who'd been involved with Phoenix Transplant Network. Some testified they'd been coerced through threats after falling into debt with criminal organizations. Others admitted they'd participated voluntarily, desperate for money and convinced their children would survive the procedures. One mother broke down on the witness stand describing how her daughter had died during a liver harvesting procedure. and how she'd been paid $50,000 to stay quiet about what happened. The courtroom fell silent during her testimony, several jury members visibly crying. My father's defense tried to argue he'd been deceived by Dr. Brennan, that he'd believed the procedures were legitimate living donor transplants where I'd be safe and compensated. But prosecutors showed emails where my father had explicitly asked about risks and acknowledged the procedures violated medical ethics and laws. He'd known exactly what he was agreeing to, had understood Ethan might die during the process, and had proceeded anyway because the financial compensation was too appealing to refuse. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. My father was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole for conspiracy to commit murder, human trafficking, and racketeering. My mother received 25 years for her role as an accessory and for failing to protect her children from harm. Dr. Brennan got life without parole, and the other physicians received sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years. The recipients who'd knowingly participated in the illegal organ trade faced criminal charges as well, though many claimed they hadn't known the organs came from living children who were essentially being murdered. The entire Phoenix transplant network was dismantled, with over 40 arrests across 6 states. The organization's financial assets were seized and used to establish a victim compensation fund for the families of children who'd been killed or harmed through the network. I spent the next several years in foster care with the Kowalskis, who eventually asked if they could adopt me. I agreed because I had nowhere else to go, and they'd been kind to me throughout everything. The legal process took time, but eventually I became their son officially, taking their last name and starting to build something resembling a normal life. I had extensive therapy to process the trauma of discovering my parents had planned to kill me for money and learning that my brother had actually been murdered rather than dying from surgical complications. The therapist specialized in complex trauma and helped me understand that my parents' choices reflected their own moral failures and not any lack of worth in me or Ethan. We'd been children who deserved protection, and our parents had fundamentally betrayed that responsibility in the worst possible way. I struggled with trust issues and anxiety, especially around medical settings. Every doctor's appointment triggered panic attacks until my therapist worked with me to develop coping strategies. I graduated high school and went to college studying criminal justice, wanting to understand the systems that had failed to protect children like me and Ethan until it was too late. I connected with other survivors from the Phoenix Transplant Network case, and we formed a support group, sharing our experiences and working through our trauma together. My biological parents sent letters from prison asking to reconcile, claiming they'd been desperate and made terrible mistakes, but still loved me. I never responded to those letters. Love doesn't sell your children's organs to strangers. Love doesn't knowingly send your son to die on an operating table for money. Whatever my parents felt for me, it wasn't love in any meaningful sense. They'd valued financial security over my life, and that choice was unforgivable. I think about Ethan constantly, wondering what he would have become if he'd been allowed to live. He'd wanted to study medicine, ironically, hoping to become a surgeon who helped people. Instead, he'd been killed by corrupt physicians who'd turned healing into a profitable business of death. I visit his grave sometimes and tell him I'm sorry I didn't understand what happened sooner, that maybe if I'd been older or more aware, I could have saved him. My therapist says that's survivor's guilt and not rational, that I was a child with no power to stop what happened. But the guilt persists, regardless of logic. The Phoenix Transplant Network case led to major reforms in organ transplant oversight and stricter regulations around living donor procedures. It became federal law that any living donor transplant had to be approved by independent medical ethics boards with no financial stake in the outcome. Compensation for organ donation remained illegal, and penalties were increased for violations. Medical licensing boards implemented more rigorous background checks and monitoring of transplant surgeons. None of these changes brought back the 12 children who died, but maybe they'd prevent future networks from operating so openly. I testified before Congress about my experience and pushed for stronger protections for children in medical settings. I work now as an advocate for victims of human trafficking and organ trade crimes, using my story to raise awareness about how these networks operate and recruit victims. It's difficult work that requires me to constantly revisit my own trauma, but it feels necessary. Every child we protect from similar exploitation is a small victory against the darkness that took Ethan and almost took me. I'm 23 now, the same age Ethan would have been if he'd lived. I've built a life for myself that includes meaningful relationships and work I care about. But there's always a shadow over everything, a awareness that my own father tried to kill me for profit. That knowledge changes you fundamentally and never fully goes away. But I'm still here, still fighting, still determined that Ethan's death and my survival should mean something larger than just our individual stories. The system that enabled Phoenix Transplant Network to operate for over a decade needs to be dismantled completely, and I'll keep working toward that goal for as long as it takes. Justice was served in the legal sense, with my parents and their accomplices imprisoned for their crimes. Whether that brings any real peace is something I'm still figuring out. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.